Welcome back to UC Davis Live, COVID-19. I'm Satirius Johnson. While the world has been dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic, we're also feeling the impacts of climate change. For example, in California, the wildfires and a series of hurricanes battering the Southeast. What parallels are there between the pandemic and the climate crisis, and how do they affect each other? Well, joining us today are two UC Davis experts with perspectives on the intersection of climate and COVID-19. In fact, they're featured in the current season of Unfold, a UC Davis podcast, which is focusing on climate change this season. You can find Unfold on the usual podcast apps and at ucdavis.edu/unfold. Tracy Goldstein is a professor in the Department of Pathology, Immunology, and Microbiology at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. She's also Associate Director of the One Health Institute, where she directs the One Health Institute Laboratory. And Fraser Schilling is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy and director of the UC Davis Road Ecology Center. His research is on the impact of human activities on natural systems, especially in the area of transportation. Thanks to you both for joining us today.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So before we get started, I'd just like to remind viewers that this is a free webcast. You can watch it live and watch it after the live broadcast on the UC Davis Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube channels. We are aware that others are posting links saying that you have to pay to watch this video. Please do not click on those links. This is a free webcast. And we are taking audience questions. So if you're watching us live, just leave them in the comments section and we'll work in as many as we can. So Fraser, let's start off with you. You've looked at how much people have been traveling during this pandemic. What has the impact been on greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, the amount of travel reduction has been marketed. Anybody who's driven, who's commuted, or just gone on a trip across Northern California, you've seen a big reduction in traffic. It's primarily commuter traffic, driving to work traffic, not so much the freight traffic. Throughout California, it was about a 75% reduction in traffic at the beginning of the pandemic, at least beginning of the shelter-in-place orders, and across the US, about a 70% reduction. And that led to a lot of silver linings, we call them. And some of those are related to climate change, some related to the number of crashes that we've experienced on roads. And in terms of climate change, the transportation is one of the biggest contributors to climate change through carbon dioxide and other gases released in our exhaust. And actually during the production of the fuel, you get releases of things like methane. So these all contribute to what we used to call global warming, and now what we call climate change. And so anytime you reduce the production of fuel or the use of fuel, you're going to reduce the greenhouse gas effect, basically. And so because we had that 70% roughly reduction in driving, we had a similar about 70% reduction in production of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's
huge. That's
unprecedented.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah. It actually helps us to partway meet our Paris Climate Accord goals, including the US met part of our Paris Climate Accord goals, even though we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord.
Right. And in addition to greenhouse gases, what's the effect been on the number of, say, animals killed on roads?
Yeah, so there's been as I said, a lot of environmental silver linings. One of those is a reduction of collisions with animals. And for many animals throughout the world, including in the US and in California, being hit by a car is one of the primary ways that they would die a non-natural death, let's say. And in California, it's in the top 3 for most species as a threat, roads and traffic. So anytime you reduce traffic, you're going to reduce that impact. And so we looked at several states in the US, and there was about a 1/3 reduction in rate of collisions with animals across those states. We think they're representative of the country. So that's about a 1/3 reduction in direct impacts to wildlife where they're hit by a car. And if you extrapolate that across the country and think about the number of animals that are tens of millions fewer animals were killed this year due to our reduction in driving than would normally be killed. That's the largest conservation action that we've ever taken for wildlife, except making the national parks. So really, in the last 100 years, it's one of the most significant things that we've done for wildlife is just drive less because of the pandemic.
It's incredible to think that something like this pandemic could actually be making such huge impacts on the environment. Are you, from what you can tell so far, are we seeing any sustained changes in transportation that could affect these things like greenhouse emissions and animal killings, things like that?
Yeah, so there was interesting and maybe predictable response. Some states had less reduction in driving than other states. Washington, D.C. had the greatest reduction. Alabama had the least reduction. And the return to pre-pandemic rates of driving have also been similar to that. And I'll let the viewers figure out what that means. But it's basically some states wanted to get back on the road immediately and went back to normal levels of driving. California is at about 80 to 90% of what we might call normal or pre-pandemic. So there's been a return to driving levels. And I think that those will stay like that if we don't have another reduction in economic activity and if we have shelter-in-place orders for counties and cities and regions and so forth, that might cause that reduction again. That's in the driving, personal driving. In the freight movement space, which is a large amount of traffic, that freight movement has continued. So that wasn't impacted as much. That does go up and down with economy. So there was some reduction, but it wasn't quite the same as the commuting traffic, the work from home phenomenon, obviously. Transit, totally different story. Very sad story where transit was hugely affected and some transit might go away. We might lose it because we lost interest in it.
Right. Public transportation, right? You're talking about
public transportation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Have these kind of like real world phenomena helped you to kind of better fine tune modeling when you kind of predict kind of like a reduction in this, what would happen? Have you been able to like better fine tune the way that you model how changes would affect the real world?
Absolutely. And that's a great question. Where'd you get those questions? These are great questions. So this is, if you think about how we operate as humans in the world, we just plow forward full steam. And to understand how we have impacts, you want to experimentally change that and control that in order to then predict, okay, this is what our impacts are going to be in the future. We never get to do that. If we proposed, let's say all scientists, we put in a group proposal to the National Science Foundation. We said next year, we want to reduce traffic by 20% to see what happens. Yeah, we're not going to get any of that. So the fact that this did happen meant that across all of these different things, whether they're silver linings or bad things that could happen as a reduction in traffic, we were able to, we had this unintentional experiment. And we have before and after, we have before the pandemic, during the pandemic, after the pandemic, and then during the next surge of the pandemic, you know. So we have these variations that are really critical to understanding the impacts of transportation. And that is an unbelievable opportunity. And it will inform future science, may not inform policy. That always depends on the administration that you have. But it certainly will inform science and how we understand transportation's interplay with nature and society.
All right. I'm sure you're still crunching those numbers and the data is still coming in because we're still in this pandemic.
Yeah.
Right. I'd just like to remind people watching, if you're watching us live and would like to ask a question, just leave them into the comment section and we'll work in as many as we can. Tracy, how might climate change affect disease outbreaks? I mean, could it make them more likely or possibly worse?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'll start with some of the work I've done in the Arctic, where we see that as sea ice is melting, it's opening up channels in the ice and allowing for animals to move into places where they didn't used to move, and with that, bring their diseases. Also, as the ice is melting, you'll get runoff from land to sea, and that might bring sort of human or terrestrial pathogens, you know, into the ocean. Um, the other thing that we're noticing up in the Arctic is that, for example, 2019, there was no ice that formed between Russia and Alaska in the Bering Sea. So that really heavily affects where the animals are able to go to haul out and have their babies. Also, as the oceans warmer, they have to go further offshore or deeper to find food. So all of that over time may affect their health and their body condition. And the interesting effect up there in Alaska is, human health and animal health is so connected. So people rely on animals for subsistence. And so when the animals are going further offshore or deeper, that means that the hunts have to go further offshore and deeper. And so that's really heavily affecting the livelihoods of people. And then also the villages, as the villages are, the ice is melting, they're losing their lifestyles. So I think that climate change heavily is linked to either disease movement as animals and people move, or just to affecting the condition of people and animals, which will make them more susceptible to disease.
Is there any evidence that the pandemic is slowing down how people move into wild habitats and possibly, get exposed to new diseases?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot of the things that we normally are out in the field monitoring haven't been possible because of the pandemic. A lot of travel and field work is not happening. But I think what you're referring to, there are much sort of larger, longer term scales of activities than sort of the things that Fraser were talking about. So when you're thinking about things that affect climate change and disease movement, we're talking land use change, deforestation, building roads, moving into buffer areas, where wildlife live, expanding farmlands so that you can have more space for animal grazing or cropland. And so those are much more long-term, long-scale things that I don't think have, in my opinion, changed very much in the pandemic, because we continue to need food, we continue to need to grow crops. And in low resource places, people continue to go hunt for protein. So I think all of those things are contributing to spillover events and contact with animals. And I don't think the pandemic has actually changed that in a lot of those limited resources places, because lifestyles are quite different than the way that we get our food here in the US.
Right. Well, I guess this kind of transitions to my next question. Are the same communities more at risk for both climate change and COVID-19? Are there just some places that, these two things come together more, kind of more strongly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the parallels between the communities that are so heavily affected by COVID-19 and by climate change have, to me, been really astounding, right? So these are often places with limited resources, maybe remote locations, not good health infrastructure, health support, and also a lot of pre-existing health conditions. And so to me, it's been pretty astounding. I think early on in the pandemic, somebody asked me a question about climate change in the pandemic, and it didn't seem so obvious. But right now, to me, it just seems like those communities that are so heavily hit by both are sadly the same. We all, of course, are affected by COVID-19, but I think that there are some communities that are more heavily hit, and we've obviously talked about that a lot in the news, and starting to understand why. And I think that disparity is going to continue as we see the climate change emergency worsen. COVID-19, hopefully, at some point, we'll get over this pandemic and life can go somewhat back to some sort of new normal. But I think climate change is going to continue, and I hope that we can learn from this pandemic and which communities are most at risk, and then see what we can do to mitigate that as the climate change emergency worsens.
I know we've been talking about how, the pandemic has possibly been having some positive effects as far as slowing down climate change. Is it possible that the two might be compounding the effects of each other? Could it be possible that the virus is making climate change worse on some level, or maybe climate change making the pandemic worse, or maybe the opposite? What is the relationship there?
I mean, I think, you use California as an example, and I think here we definitely are feeling the compounded effects of those two things, with the wildfires, people being displaced from their homes in a place at a time when, we need to be staying home and separating ourselves from others. So I do think there's some examples like the hurricane on the East Coast are another example of, rather than being able to maintain your social distancing, you're being put into a situation where you have to find a new way to protect yourself. So I think that, the disaster services in this country have really had to rethink how you manage disasters and how you manage people. And I'm hoping that there are lessons learned there that we can implement in the future, that might help us with climate change. But it's been really interesting. I'll talk sort of from the animal side, and again up in the Arctic, because of the severe reduction in sea ice in the winter over the last couple of years. This was going to be a really, really important year to get out into the ocean, monitor the populations, and see what was happening. And instead, we haven't been able to get out there. So information that we're collecting is sort of satellite data, trying to track water temperatures and sea ice from afar, but we just haven't had the opportunity to really go and see what's happening. And so this time next year, hopefully we can get out there and maybe able to answer your questions a little bit better about the effects that this pandemic is having, out in the environment and on animal populations.
Once again, if you're watching us live and would like to ask a question, just leave them in the comments and we'll try to work it in. I'd like to hear from both of you on, scientists have been warning for so many years about climate change and about pandemics, to be honest. Is there a parallel in how those warnings have been received by policymakers and the public?
Do you want to start or do you want me to, Fraser?
To what Tracy was saying earlier with the compounding effect and the pandemic climate change relationship. And one of the, I don't know if it's a type of community, but certainly essential workers, which is a nice term for people who are forced to go to work and do things for us so that we can stay at home. That's a large group of people, and many of them are low income. And so low income communities of color, certain neighborhoods in different areas, they're much more likely to be impacted by climate change. And they're also going to probably get disproportionate impacts from the pandemic. I know from my own family's work environments that there are people who have to go to work in person. And that's just not true for a lot of us. And so that really changes their risk. And they are also potentially going to be more exposed to climate change. So there is that compounded risk to disproportionate to certain members of society. And I think we just kind of gloss over that in some respects, and that's not okay. In terms of your other question, I think it's become very political, like climate change, and I think it's for the same reason. Well, it's for the same couple of reasons. One is that understanding science is not really emphasized in this country, and it's true for other countries as well. But for the biggest economy in the world, and California, the sixth or fifth biggest economy in the world, it's remarkable how low our societal level of understanding of science is, and that ill prepares everybody across the board for really understanding what is climate change and how does it affect me, and what is a pandemic and how does it affect me. And so people don't have the tools to respond appropriately, and we can't blame them for that. We can blame inadequate education, poor public relations on the part of government, poor media-based education. Media has a role in educating as well. And I think all of that leads to society in the US just not being prepared to deal with these things. And then policymakers or decision makers, ironically, we always have to simplify things for them. They respond to the public. And if the public isn't responding appropriately, then maybe they aren't going to respond appropriately as well. So you end up with this really tricky situation where we think we're making science-based policy and decisions, but we're doing it in a partial vacuum.
Yeah, and I think the thing I would add to that is, and it sort of amazed me in this pandemic, and something that I've always thought about with climate change as well, is it seems like there's this they're opposite from, economic prosperity and well-doing. And I think they're just simply not. They're tightly linked, so it's been pointed out by many, but the economy can't recover from this pandemic until we can recover from the pandemic and not continue to have more cases and deaths. And I would say it's a sort of a similar argument with climate change. I mean, there are many economic opportunities where responding to climate change will build jobs and build economies and improve global prosperity. And so it's been very interesting in that they've been presented in sort of these, you get one or the other, rather than these two things go hand in hand. And let's talk about how they can go hand in hand. And I agree. I mean, I think that we like to live in sun, right? So, people can't handle maybe sort of longer conversations and discussions. And then we've also become so polarized. Even if what's being said makes sense, you might not agree with it because it's coming sort of from the other side. And I don't know how this country became so separate. And if a pandemic can't unify us, I don't know what can unify us. So it does sort of scare me sometimes. And the other thing is I hear people say, well, I need an example of that. Well, do you need to see somebody die of COVID-19 to know it's true? That doesn't make sense to me. So I think it does come back to sort of education and how we present information in a compelling way. And that is back on us scientists to figure out how to do that better, I think.
Right. I want to just add an example in our history of, World War II was not a unifying event initially. There was a definite split in the US about whether the US should go to war, so to speak. Really was, catalyzed by Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor. But before that, whether or not the US should help Europe in defeating fascism, well, that's still obviously a problem right now. But back then, it was divisive, and even corporate leaders were, on the wrong side of that in terms of their links to Germany. But what really the country managed to do was the Manhattan Project. I mean, it's not a great analogy, but that is the kind of collective energy was, before the Manhattan Project, it was just collecting metal. There was different, drive less, use less fuel we needed for the war effort. There were those kinds of things, but there was also, the Manhattan Project is often used as an example of what can government do? What can it concentrate its energy on to, in this case, it was a destructive solution, but a solution to a grand problem. And a pandemic or climate change needs that kind of massive collective enterprise to solve a grand problem. And that's, I think, is possible. Historically, we've done it, and I think we can do it in this case as well.
We have a question from a viewer. Amanda on Facebook is asking, she says, my kids are very concerned about global warming, but aren't seeing a difference in the things we do at home, like recycling. Do you have any suggestions for what else kids can do above and beyond regular household choices, i.e. composting, planting, pollinator-friendly plants, etc.?
Tracy, you want to go?
Oh, that's a hard one. I mean, I think that climate change can feel so overwhelming and we all need to do our little part. So I do think it is important. Recycling and composting is important. The other thing I've seen kids do is sponsor conservation programs that are willing to help to save wildlife and wildlife habitat. Obviously, children, it's hard to do that, but voting, it's important for us to vote so that we can conserve habitat and national parks and national forests and marine ecosystems. All of those are really, really important. And so I think, our vote is one way. We can sponsor projects as well as do what we can at home. Those are the things that very quickly come to mind.
Craig on Facebook.
I'd like to
go ahead.
Actually, I would put a plug in for, there's very little attention is paid to how much, or some attention is paid to how much does a particular activity reduce climate change. My own personal activity. Recycling is very problematic. It's not done well. It's actually there's been investigations to show very little material ends up being pulled back into the chain, especially plastics, and that's due to intervention from the plastics industry. So what are we doing, and what level of impact does it have? So there's three big ones. Don't eat meat, or if you eat meat every day, eat it once a week. Don't drive just for the hell of it, or heck of it. Keep that down. No useless trips. And the third one, change the thermostat. Those are the big ones. And if you do one or all three of those, your personal change, and then your familial change, and then you have a multiplier effect if you're the example, that change propagates. That's the real change. That's where the individual becomes society, and then we enact that change that we're all looking for. Is everybody doing it?
So President Carter was right back in 1978 or whenever it was, when he said, raise the air conditioning to whatever it was, 78 degrees, and people were up in arms about it. But he was right. I mean, that's
he's been right about so many things. I mean, look at Habitat for Humanity. Maybe he was the last good president. I don't know. He probably did some bad stuff too as commander in chief, but yeah.
So we have another question.
One thing I would add is there are some. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a lot of globally conscious and environmentally conscious companies out there that you could, so you can think about if you're buying your clothes or even your toilet paper from recyclable materials. And so I think that's the other way we can make a difference with our pocketbook, and thinking about the companies that we're purchasing from and supporting the ones that we believe in environmentally.
Right. So creating a demand for recycled products would help a lot. Yeah,
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Craig on Facebook is asking, how does wildfire smoke affect wildlife and livestock?
Yeah, I mean, this outbreak, these wildfires have really highlighted that. So a ton of livestock sadly lost their homes, especially in the wildfire that occurred right close to Davis over here, just up the street in Vacaville. There was such fast moving that people actually just simply couldn't get to their animals in time. Many of those burned animals did end up at the UC Davis Veterinary Medical Teaching Hospital. And so, of course, you can go online and see some of those stories. And we also have a team that goes out to the farms and looks at animals at the farms after the files have gone through to check the health and see what health they need, all the way from chickens up to llamas. And I think for many of those animals, they aren't able to leave like we're able to leave, right? We evacuate and we leave, and many of them stay. And so I think the air quality is affecting their health, as well as just simply their access to food, water, safe care. And similarly for wildlife, I think we don't yet know the effect of how many wildlife have been displaced and how many lost their lives during these various fires. But definitely, in other ones, we've seen the effects. Recently, UC Davis has taken in some mountain lion cubs that have been burned. And in other wildfires, they've addressed burned animals from other species. So absolutely, animals are being displaced. And of course, we have to think about humans and what the humans are losing. But at the same time, it's really hard for me to not think about the animal and wildlife losses that are occurring at the same time.
Yeah, the loss of habitat. I live on the edge of the LNU fire complex. So half a mile down the street is the first part of the burn. And the loss of habitat, the initial destruction, loss of habitat, and then animals dying. The secondary loss of then, once the habitat's burned, it takes a while for it to grow back. And so you have this big blank area for a long time. And then the smoke, we study our own health very well. We're really well, pretty well. We understand the pulmonary effects of particulates and smoke on us. We're a good model for other things with pulmonary systems. We're a good model for things that breathe into lungs that are sensitive. And if the air is very unhealthy or unhealthy for us, it's certainly the same for wildlife and domestic animals. And so if we don't want to be there, if we are going to be sick, if we're there, it's definitely also true for them. They just can't leave as readily, or if they try to, they run into us on the edge, society.
Right. Referring back to what we were talking about before, we've dropped a link to a blog with 18 ways you can make a difference with climate change in the comments section of wherever people are watching this. So if people are interested, they can read more about that. Just to wrap up, I mean, do you think there are any lessons we can draw from dealing with this pandemic, either in this country or abroad, that we can apply to the climate change crisis or vice versa?
I mean, I would say firstly, I really hope that we've learned some lessons about sort of the inequalities in our society and who is being heavily impacted, and I'm hoping that we can do things to address that in the future, whether it's from the healthcare side or society or social injustice. I mean, I think that so many things have been brought to the forefront during this pandemic, and if we just wipe those under the rug after this pandemic and ignore them, then really bad on us. But I'm hoping that these are lessons learned, that things that we can take out into the communities and improve our communities. I'm also still hopeful, given what you were saying, Fraser, about sort of towards the end of World War II. I am still hopeful that our community will sort of come together and unite and be more altruistic and put effort into communities and places where we need to, and improve the livelihoods. That's sort of a little bit aspirational, but that's what I'm hoping might come out of this. So
I think we have to be aspirational. I mean, we don't get moments like this handed to us very often. And that sounds like a positive spin on something very terrible, but it's a learning moment. And there's bends in history, right, where you have learning moments and you either learn well or you learn poorly. And that really determines your success as a society, success as a species. And this is a learning moment. This is an intense learning moment. My son had COVID-19. He recovered. He's fine. We suspect other members of our family did. There's going to be these long-lasting effects. We had these various silver linings. And layered over, we had growing awareness among parts of society that there's systemic racism, that there's police brutality selectively against brown and black people, that there's economic problems and exposure and risk to vast sectors of society. It's kind of like a Katrina moment, but across the whole world. And what we learned from Katrina, I think, is that we don't learn from Katrina, right? The first lesson of Katrina is that we didn't do anything afterwards. I think we need to take these opportunities and make them into learning moments. We need to push ourselves really and act as great examples for future generations, and not just a bad footnote in history of they had this chance and they blew it. That's what we have in front of us, and I think that's what we have to do.
Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation, and I think you're right. I think this is something that we need to use to do better, to do better on both fronts, pandemics and climate change. And we are learning so much about the two, and it's a really it's a great opportunity to kind of make something good out of something very terrible.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you both for coming on today. Thanks for joining us.
thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks very much. This is interesting.
Tracy Goldstein is a professor in the Department of Pathology, Immunology, and Microbiology at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine and Associate Director of the One Health Institute. Fraser Schilling is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy and also Director of the UC Davis Road Ecology Center. On the next UC Davis Live, we're going to pivot to another timely topic, not COVID related, but we'll be looking into the health impacts of wildfires. By the way, the second season of Unfold, a UC Davis podcast, focuses on climate change. New episodes drop every Tuesday. You can hear Unfold on demand for free. It's available on podcast apps and at ucdavis.edu/unfold. Until next time, I'm Satirius Johnson, and this is UC Davis Live.